Welcome everybody to today's episode of My Dead Dragon. I'm your host, Katherine Loranger, and I'm in conversation today with Caire Nettley. And Caire is a coach, a teacher, a speaker, and founder of Better Boundaries. She's known for helping her clients to find their no, to set boundaries and build a strong sense of who they are so that they can show up in their lives and relationships without losing themselves. And Caire, I'm really interested to hear your story, your journey, better boundaries, right? I think that really fits with the theme of My Dead Dragon, of the podcast. And so can you start us out? So welcome to the podcast. Super excited to have you here. And can you start us out by telling us a little bit about your story and what kind of brought you to Better Boundaries and doing the work that you do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Always happy to be talking about boundaries and always happy to be talking about people's stories, not just my story, but I think, so many, and in listening to some of your previous podcasts, we all have so much to learn from each other. So I think it's wonderful what you're doing. Okay, so a little bit about my story. Well, I grew up in England. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat all of a sudden. I grew up in England. I moved to Australia 18 years ago now. And I was working in sports marketing about 10 years ago. This was about 10 years ago. And I was, on paper, very successful. I had a property, I had a great job. I was working in sports marketing, and a job that a lot of people would have wanted, would have coveted. And I was also studying to be a yoga teacher. So something was calling me. I don't know how I thought I could do the job I was doing and study a 2-year diploma to become a yoga teacher at the same time, but that was part of my dysfunction, trying to do all the things. And this job was so demanding. It took so much out of me. It was evenings, it was weekends, it was always on my mind. And it came to the point where all the other areas of my life were being sacrificed. And this was a recurring pattern in my life. Anyway, I ended up eventually suffering from burnout, and I quit my job and decided to sort of throw myself into yoga teaching. And I took some time out as well to really recoup, because I was so exhausted, so depleted. I really wasn't in a great space mentally, physically, emotionally. And it was through this process of sort of burning out, and I was in a huge amount of back pain. Through the yoga teacher training, I discovered all these things that I physically couldn't do, all these limitations in my body, and how stiff and closed off my body was. And I just started to realize how I had this broken relationship with myself. And all this awareness started to come up, which is part of the process of yoga. So yoga brings our attention in, it brings our attention inside of ourselves. And my attention was always externally. My attention was on what other people were doing, what other people thought of me, how I measured up, was I enough? I was always focused on the outside and very little on the inside, because I was ultimately very disconnected from the inside of me. So yoga started to bring all this stuff to the surface, and I started to see that work was really a way for me to avoid the rest of my life and to avoid feelings that were really buried quite deep inside of me. And I went on this yoga teacher training, and it was a 3-week training. It was advanced teacher training after the 2 years that I'd done. And we spent 3 weeks really diving into the body, really down to a cellular level in the body. It's quite incredible. And it was through that process that all these things started to unravel. And I really just spent 3 weeks crying. All this old trauma came up. I had all this awareness about these patterns in my life, these patterns of, I was a chronic people pleaser. I was a rescuer. I would fix things. I would give people advice. I was great at running everybody else's lives. And I was great in work because I was such a high performer. And people labeled me superwoman. But on the inside, I was so disconnected and so running from my own pain and my own trauma and my own history that eventually the moment I gave myself space for that stuff to come up, it came up.
Yeah.
And it was really a process of working through that, and more and more lights came on. It wasn't this, it was sort of this slow process of unpacking all this stuff that had happened for me and the way that I was living my life and the way that I was avoiding responsibility in a lot of areas of my life. So there was this slow unpacking, and then this moment of, I'm 100% responsible for my life, which was liberating and terrifying at the same time. And then it's this process of rebuilding trust with ourselves, right?
Yeah. Wow, Claire, so much there. And so you mentioned that there was this pattern of overfunctioning with work. At that time, did you know that was a pattern, or was it kind of after, when you started really giving yourself space, that you realized, oh, that's what was happening?
I didn't realize it was a pattern. I thought there was actually something wrong with me in that I saw everybody else working at this extreme pace and putting in all these long hours. And I was exhausted. I was having panic attacks. I was taking beta blockers to try and mask the symptoms of my anxiety. And so I just thought it was normal, and that I didn't measure up. And I was sort of going, well, I don't have children, and other people have children, and they're holding down these jobs. What's wrong with me? So I just worked harder and harder to prove myself. So no, I wasn't really, if I'd been really honest with myself at the time, if I'd been able to do that, I would have, and I did. I came to a point where I went, this is actually not right. I'm crying at work. I'm crying in the toilets. I'm taking beta blockers. I'm having panic attacks. I'm labeled superwoman on the outside, but on the inside, I'm just in so much pain. And so, it took me a while to become aware of the pattern, and this pattern of overfunctioning in all areas of my life. I overfunctioned in relationships. I would do way more than the other people in my relationships. So I had very one-sided relationships often. And it varied. So with some people, I would be the person that gave too much. And then with other people, I would be the person that didn't give. So a lot of my life was really out of balance.
Wow. So with the overfunctioning, what was the process? What did that look like for you to notice that, and then to actually move into a state of greater balance? How did you do that?
It was yoga. It was yoga and meditation, really, because I was operating at such a fast pace in my life. I was living my life at 100 miles an hour. And when I really sort of fell apart and had that horrible case of burnout, I was seeing a acupuncturist, and she said to me, Claire, why are you always in such a hurry? What are you racing towards? The only thing that you're racing towards is your own death.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. It was like a sort of very compassionate slap across the face, or someone throwing a cold glass of water on you that wakes you up. Sorry, what was the question again?
So noticing the overfunctioning, and then what was that process of coming into balance?
Yes. So it was through my yoga practice, which was incredibly slow. So during my teacher training, I had a back injury, And it was an injury in my sacroiliac joint. It's quite a common injury in yoga, and it's the sacroiliac joint is where the pelvis connects to the spine. And there was a teacher on my course who was doing a study in sacroiliac injury, and she was looking for volunteers. So she asked me if I would volunteer for her, and she would give me a program. So before my yoga teacher training, I did power yoga, I did hot yoga, and I see that now. I see it with a lot of type A, all the push yoga, the faster, and people love it because they work up a sweat, but really what they're doing is just getting all the adrenaline out of their system. So in this practice that this teacher gave me, it was so slow, it was excruciating. You imagine I'm a type A going at 100 miles an hour up here, and then I'm given this practice, which is basically, if I do one sort of demonstration, it would be, you move with the breath at this sort of inhale, exhale. So that was the pace of the practice. And I said to the teacher, I was like, are you kidding me? This is going to drive me insane. And it did. It drove me insane. It was so slow. And that's now how I practice. And it was this, I had to do really the opposite of what I was doing in my everyday life, and slow down and meet myself. So it was that process, and it was meditation that really helped me to come back more into balance, and to become aware of my impulses, to fix my impulses, to rescue my impulses, to take over things that weren't my responsibility. It was through that slowing down process and meeting myself that I became more conscious of those things, and then I could make different choices.
So along that way of leaning into, relaxing into a slower yoga practice, coming from that kind of like ramped up type A into the, maybe not the polar opposite, but definitely the yin and the yang there. So my guess is that you actually had to make a series of choices and decisions along the way to really be in that uncomfortable place of being present with yourself. So what did that look like? What was that? Can you recall, like, what was that initial moment where you're like, okay, this, what I've been doing is not working, and I'm willing to trust this process? And then along the journey, what were the pieces that kept you going?
The initial catalyst was the practice that I was having to do for this teacher, this to do with my body. My body was crying out to me to slow down. So that got me in a habit of getting up every morning and doing a yoga practice, whether I wanted to or not.
Okay.
And what started out as discipline, it was about building new habits. So it was learning to do things I didn't want to do, and going, okay, I'm not going to enjoy this for a while. I'm going to find this really difficult and really unpleasant for probably a month until it becomes a new habit. And when I set my expectations like that, that's what it then became. And I went, okay, I don't enjoy this, but I'm going to do it. And I would start with little increments. So I would say, okay, I'll start with 5 minutes. And it would end up becoming a 20, 30, 40, sometimes an hour, sometimes a 2-hour practice if I had the time. So it was really that sort of started me off. And then it just became a new habit, and it became a new way of being that that I could then take into other areas of my life. I could then go, well, okay, I might not enjoy this initially, but the results that I'm going to get are going to far outweigh what I'm doing impulsively in the moment because I want to. So it was really learning to recalibrate the way that I operated.
Yeah. And what's kind of emerging for me as well as you share that is that to me, it feels like this process of really rebuilding integrity with yourself in terms of being able to trust yourself with yourself.
Yes. And and stopping from having my intention outside and really bringing it inside, bringing it back to myself, back to what is right for me. Because you asked before about how I came to working with boundaries, and boundaries really helped me build that trust. I didn't know what boundaries were before I sort of embarked on this whole journey. And someone said to me, it sounds like you could do with better boundaries in your life. And I was like, what's boundaries? And then I started researching.
Yeah.
And it was like this light bulb went on. And boundaries are really about giving ourselves permission to be who we are, to pursue our goals, to show up in the way that we want to show up, to identify what is us, to identify what isn't us, what's our responsibility, what's not our responsibility. I always felt overly responsible for other things. So I didn't really know where I ended and other people began. And I would take on people's feelings. But really what was happening then was I was projecting my own feelings onto other people.
Yeah.
So when I was in that space of not really connecting to myself, I couldn't really see other people because I couldn't really see myself. I wasn't connected to myself. I wasn't present with myself. So I really couldn't be present and connected to other people in the way that I wanted to be.
And that makes so much sense, that when you don't have those boundaries, you really don't know, who am I? So it's just all this big mush of messiness, right? And I'm thinking about the piece where you shared the perception in that job where it looked like everybody else had it going on, and it was actually just you who was on the inside kind of caving. So with the perspective of boundaries now and the work that you've done, when you cast a glance back at that and the way that you were kind of looking at your experience, feeling like I'm the only one who's not got this figured out, right? I don't have kids, and yet all these other people are working at the same pace. Do you think that they actually were working in a healthy way?
Probably not. I don't know that it was a particularly healthy environment. I think any environment that constantly requires us to abandon our humanity for the purpose of something, for the purpose of achievement or success. I had to really define what success meant to me, and I hadn't done that. It was based on what society determines as success. And when I sat down and looked at what success meant for me, I was really surprised. It had nothing to do with money, achievement. It was much more about connection, living from my values, feeling fulfilled. Yeah. And so to answer your question, do I think they were working in a healthy way? I don't know. I honestly don't know. But what I do know now is that most people wear a mask, is that most people wear the "I've got it all together" mask. Everything's okay, everything's fine. And for most people, underneath the surface, it's not fine. We might look calm on the surface, but underneath we're sort of frantically treading water. And I think that's a lot of people's reality. I don't think anyone has it figured out. Yeah. I think we're all doing the best with what we know. And in listening to your interview with Amanda, I think you mentioned something about we're only ever operating at our current level of awareness and consciousness. And so we have to forgive ourselves for what we didn't know. And now I know I can make better choices. And now what I hear, it's so funny when I hear people say, "Oh, she's amazing. She just takes care of everyone." If someone's talking about somebody else, she's incredible. She does all this stuff. She's fantastic. She's always available for people. She's so selfless. I think she needs boundaries.
Yeah.
It always goes through my mind. I'm thinking that external view that people have of that person is probably quite different for what's going on internally for that person.
Mm-hmm. But interesting that there is that social praise to really just completely give over yourself. And so to actually be able to set those boundaries and come from a more authentic set of values and purpose in your life takes some courage.
It really does take courage, and it takes the ability, and this is where the mindfulness and meditation practice really helped me. And this is why I combine that with the coaching. The coaching is really the practical tools and strategies and skills. But the mindfulness helps people lean into the discomfort, because if this is how people have been trained to be in the world, to go against that and to go against what society is doing, to go against what other people expect of you, is really tough, and it's uncomfortable, and people feel fear, they feel guilt, they feel shame, they feel all these feelings, all these things come up, and they resist making change because of it. These feelings tend to control them.
Yeah.
And then what happens is the resentment, the anger, all these things build, and people feel disconnected because they're living according to what the outside expects of them. But in reality, most of it is in our heads. And yes, some people won't like our boundaries. And yes, some people will be upset with us. And I often hear people say to me, I can't do that, they'll be upset. And my point back to them is yes, and because it's not about me taking responsibility for other people's feelings anymore. When I take 100% responsibility in my life, it's 100% responsibility for my feelings, not for other people's feelings. Other people's feelings are their responsibility. That doesn't mean I don't care. It just means I don't operate around what I think other people's feelings might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we can never really know.
No, we can't. And it also tests the quality of the relationship. And I'm not talking here about testing relationships, but you work out pretty quickly who's with you and who's for you. And the ones that aren't will drop away pretty quickly if they're not getting their needs met. A true connected relationship is one where both parties can have a dialogue. Both parties are committed to showing up in the relationship, even when it's uncomfortable. Healthy relationships don't require us to abandon ourselves.
Yeah.
And I always say to my friends, tell me no. And they know I'm the no person.
Yeah.
You know, they often say to me, I know you can hear this. And I'm like, yeah, I can. You know, yes, you can change your mind. You know, you can say no to me. You can do what feels right for you. And I want the people I love to feel free in relationship, not obligated.
Because that no has nothing to do with you.
No.
It's about them taking care of themselves when you're in that healthy relationship.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Claire, what were some of the challenges for you in that process of really coming to that understanding of this is what's important to me in my life, and I'm recognizing that I'm surrounded by these societal pressures and expectations of what success looks like. This is actually what it looks like for me. So what were the challenges in living into what your success looks like in the midst of these social expectations and pressures?
One of the biggest challenges is really overcoming that pull to be different. It's almost like this energetic pull that is society's expectations of us. Maybe the people around us have expectations of us. So letting go, or I like the word unhooking from a lot of that stuff. Like it's almost like it's a hook in my body, and I unpick it and I go, okay, I'm letting go of that. I'm letting go of that.
Yeah.
So that was some of the biggest challenges. And sometimes I And then learning where to find compromise as well. Because when I first found my no, I loved it. I was like a 2-year-old. No, 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 not doing it, not doing it. So then it was about,
that's fantastic.
yeah. It was about learning to say yes in a healthy way. So it was giving myself permission. It was letting go of the fear, letting go of the guilt, and learning to sit with that before I let go of it. So just like in my yoga practice, I went, this is going to be really uncomfortable for a while because it's new and I don't want to do it. I don't want to sit in the discomfort. But then realizing on the other side of that was freedom. So it was learning to lean into those uncomfortable feelings and learning to sit with other people being uncomfortable with my decisions and learning to stand by myself. And sometimes I don't always get it right. Sometimes I forget, and then I realize I can change my mind. I never used to give myself permission to change my mind. And I always thought I had to have the right answer at the time. And I don't. So it was learning to give myself permission.
Yeah, so much there, in terms of developing that comfort in sitting with the discomfort. And for all of us, as we are really learning how to become the main character of our lives, it's going to require that we show up differently. And anytime we do anything different, it's uncomfortable. Anytime. And from kind of an evolutionary perspective, we evolved to be a tribal species, right? Being different actually literally meant life or death. And so we evolved to really look to the tribe for sameness and inclusion and protection and safety and all of those things. And yet in our world today, we're truly in a global society. Our tribe could be anywhere. And our survival isn't typically hinged on fitting into society's expectations. Typically, I mean, there are some things there that you want to, kind of be in alignment with. But yeah. And I love too how you recognize that it's truly a process, right? And as we grow and develop these capacities and these skills, there will be times where we are fully integrated in how they show up and how we show up in alignment. And there will be times where we are less skillful.
Yeah, sure. And especially when we're under a lot of stress, it's hard. You look at the pandemic at the moment, and we're in lockdown here. So I'm in Melbourne, and we've been in lockdown on and off for over 200 days. And that's really tested my resilience and my stress and my practice and all of that. And I have to give myself permission to not be perfect and to not always get it right, and to sometimes fall back into old habits and to kind of go, okay, well, I recognize it and I can make a different choice next time.
Yeah, that self-compassion, I think, is really key for our transformation. That as we slip backwards, that okay, there's some learning there, and absolutely there's some grace that we can offer ourselves.
Yeah.
So Claire, for people who are starting out with the process of discovering boundaries, of realizing, okay, well, where am I? Where do I start? Where does somebody else begin? What are some of the steps that people can take to really discover and create and honor those healthy boundaries for themselves?
The first thing I like to teach people, and I like to teach my clients, especially when I have a session with clients, we always start with a meditation. And we start with a feelings check. So checking in with ourselves, how do I feel right now? And that's something we can do 2 or 3 times a day to really start to bring our attention in. What is going on for me right now? And a great place to start is boundaries with ourselves. So learning and keeping a journal. So learning, when did I say yes today and I meant no? And what was going on for me in that moment? What was I afraid of? And often we're afraid of the other person being upset. We might be afraid of the other person yelling or getting angry with us, or giving us a silent treatment. There can be any number of reasons why we don't do what we know in our heart we need to do. So I get people to keep a bit of a journal and keep an eye on what they're doing throughout their day, because it's the little things throughout the day that make a difference. When someone says, can you feed my cat later? And you're already stretched to capacity and you go, yeah, sure. But on the inside, you're thinking, I don't have time to feed your cat. So just exploring those little moments. The other thing I like to get people to do is to start practicing saying, I want, I need, and I would like. Because for a lot of people, it's really difficult to say that. And people tend to dress up their wants and needs with lots of words to sort of, I call it softening the blow. People who struggle with boundaries are usually very indirect, and they're afraid to ask clearly and directly for what they want. So I get them to practice, even if it's around their own home. I want, I need, I would like, because that can be really, really uncomfortable for some people. So they're just a few things, really checking in with yourself, asking how you feel, asking in any moment, what do I want? And listening to your body. Really trying to connect with your body and listen when your body says no, because your body will tell you. That's, that's our biggest signal, is the body will say no. And we know in our gut. Again, when I was listening to your interview with Amanda, and she was talking about how she knew on the inside what she needed, but she was acting in a way that wasn't congruent with that. And we all do that until we learn to come more into alignment and speak our truth. So I think it's just good to start with that awareness. Where am I not acting congruently? And why might that be? What might be going on for me?
And so you have is it a course, a Better Boundaries course or program, or can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, I do. So it's an 8-week program. And we look at what boundaries are, what they're not. We look at why we might not have boundaries, what happened to our boundaries, what stops us from setting boundaries. We explore boundaries with ourselves, boundaries with how we treat others, boundaries around how we let others treat us. We even sort of dive into what's appropriate behavior, inappropriate behavior, abuse, what's not abuse. Because I had no idea that I was in a very abusive relationship some years ago, and I just thought it was normal. And it's not normal. It was abusive. And so it's recognizing healthy and unhealthy behaviors and looking at, well, what's a healthy relationship? What's an unhealthy relationship? So we look at that. We look at asking for our needs to be met. So using statements like I want, I need, I would like, starting to use I statements, the skills to have those difficult conversations. We look at what our life is like now and what life would be like with boundaries. There's a whole there's a whole range of things that we discuss, and it's done over 8 weeks to give people time to build their awareness, to integrate what they're learning, to practice. So there's plenty of, there's weekly lessons, then there's Q&As with me. There's usually a couple of sessions a week to allow for different time zones. And then we have practice sessions as well, so role playing and that sort of thing. So people can kind of bring those conversations that they know they need to have, but they don't want to. They can bring them to a safe space and practice and get feedback. And it's a really supportive environment as well.
That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. And I think you mentioned that your next one is starting in the new year.
Yes,
Okay.
it will be running. Yeah. Okay. So when this goes to air, there will be one already in progress, and then there'll be one coming up in the new year. So if people are interested, they can just subscribe to my email list or follow me on Instagram or Facebook. And as soon as enrollment's open, I'll let people know.
Oh, perfect. Okay. And I will include all of those links in the show notes for the listeners.
Great.
And so, Claire, any last words, if you could speak from your heart to the heart of a person listening, there's a message for them, what would that be that you'd want them to know?
I would want them to know that it's okay to be who you are. It's okay to want what you want. And it's really your purpose is to be you and to be all of you and to show up fully with all of your gifts and talents and all the things you have to offer in the world. And it's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's not selfish to focus on yourself and to focus on your life and your well-being. It's actually ultimately your responsibility, and to give yourself permission to do that.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. And so for everyone listening, you can find Claire's social links in the show notes. And I would love your support if you can subscribe and like and rate the podcast and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That really helps to share the message and get this out to the people who need to hear it. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.